Okay, so I suggest that we start the event as it's like 32 minutes past the hour. As usual, we start like a couple minutes late, but we cannot delay a little more than that. So welcome to this event, Crisis in Europe, Ukraine between Russia and the West. I'm really very honored to be hosting this event with 6 distinguished scholars in this field. 3 of them are actually going to be speaking here from this room, and 3 of them will be joining us online. So my name is Adnan Vatansever. I'm a senior lecturer at the Russia Institute and currently the acting head of the institute. And our speakers will be, I'll just go very quickly over the order that we'll have. We'll start with Domitilla Sagramoso. She comes from war studies at King's, and a lot of her focus will be on Russia's approach to the current crisis, particularly in areas such as the Minsk Agreement. Then we'll move on to Maxim Alyukov, who will be focusing primarily on media, Russian media, but also Western media with respect to the current crisis. Next, we'll move on to Alex Clarkson, who is who teaches at the European and International Studies department here at King's. And he will be focusing more on the European dimension of the current crisis. We'll have another person joining us online, Christoph Meyer, also from the same department from the European and International Studies, and he will also focus on the European dimension of the crisis. Following this, we have 2 additional speakers, Marc Berenson from the Russia Institute joining us online, and he will be speaking about the domestic politics within this as a particular dimension of this crisis, namely the types of regimes and their implications in terms of presenting constraints or motivations for the deepening of the current crisis that we've seen. And finally, Ruth Deyermond from the War Studies department will focus on the Western/NATO dimension of the rising tensions over Ukraine. So, just a few quick things about the ground rules that I'd like to mention. This is a hybrid event. Most of the participants are actually expected to be joining us online. And we have basically about 45 minutes for our distinguished guests to talk about presenting their different dimensions of the current crisis. I would suggest like 7 minutes each. This will leave us about 45 minutes for Q&A. We'll take questions from both types of audience, both from the current audience here, but also from the online audience. For the online participants, given the size of the audience, the online audience, I am suggesting that they post their questions here online in the chat, and I will try to get to them, and if possible, group some of them and ask them. When you pose a question, please indicate who exactly you would like the question to be answered. So this will kind of facilitate my task. And I hope that I can get to most of the questions that you're able to ask there. But we'll get back to having a discussion within about 40 minutes or so after the presentations. I'll just then leave the floor to Domitilla, our first speaker.
Thank you, Adnan. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here with all my colleagues. It's very interesting because we had a similar panel in 2014, and several years later we are here again discussing Ukraine. My focus is going to be on the Minsk Agreement, and which really in a way lies at the heart of one of the issues in this conflict. Interestingly, today the Duma in Russia has approved a resolution which calls for the recognition of the DNR and LNR, with so-called republics, as independent states. So it's a very interesting moment. it may seem as maybe the Minsk Agreement may completely collapse. But I think what is interesting, I'm going to go over a few points of the Minsk Agreement and what were the challenges and the positions of the sides. As we know, they come sort of in two clusters. One are sort of the security clauses, which call for a ceasefire, separation of forces, the pullout of heavy weapons, and the monitoring of the ceasefire by the OSCE. There was also a clause which called for the pull out of all foreign armed formations, military equipment and mercenaries, so that even though Russia wasn't mentioned, it was understood that Russia had to play a part in trying to pull out any kind of armed forces that it had in this area, which I'm going to call the Donbass to make it easier, but I know that there are areas of the Donbass which are not sort of under sort of separatist occupation. A very interesting clause was the clause that stated that Ukraine would restore control over its borders with Russia in these areas on the first day when elections take place in these areas in the Donbass, and then it would be the process would be completed after there is full political regulation, which meant basically constitutional reform. And this brings me to the so-called sort of political clauses, which became really the most difficult and controversial. The first one was a question of elections in these areas, in the Donbass, in the separatist regions. It was expected that Ukraine had to engage in a dialogue with the representatives of the areas of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast and to reach agreement on the modalities of these elections. So the idea was that Kiev would engage with these regions to find out the details of these elections, and that these would be carried out in accordance with Ukrainian law and also in accordance with OSCE standards, but that there had to be this kind of dialogue going on. And also it was expected that an amnesty would be implemented so that many members who participated in the fight could also participate in the elections. The most controversial point was, of course, the question of constitutional reform, because it was expected that Ukraine had to carry out or introduce a new constitution, which foresaw a key element, which was decentralization, so not federalization, but certainly as a level of decentralization, which took into account the peculiarities of these areas in the Donbass, and also, more importantly, that permanent legislation had to be approved and then introduced in the constitution that gave these regions a special status. And many conditions also were introduced in terms of respect of the Russian language, and also that a local militia could be set up. So these areas were expected to be granted a high level of autonomy. And also strong relations would be developed between these areas and the neighboring regions in Russia. However, sort of problems emerged almost immediately after this agreement was signed by the sides. First, the ceasefire was violated almost immediately. Almost days and hours after the signing of the Minsk Agreement, the separatists took control over the town of Deyermond, and fight continued along the ceasefire line for many, many years. We know there's never been a complete cessation of violence, although there have been peaks and then moments when the violence has been a bit less intense. The second problem was the question that Ukraine refused immediately to enter into negotiations with the authorities that were there at the moment in the separatist regions. So they were arguing not that they didn't want to engage in negotiations with representatives of these regions, but not with the current ones that had taken control. So that really made it very hard, and this is one of the points that Russia has been pressing constantly, that Kiev has to engage directly with the DNR, LNR authorities, whereas Ukrainians insist that they should engage with potentially new authorities once local elections take place. Also, they have insisted that elections have to be carried out in full accordance with the Ukrainian constitution. And also they introduced the idea that elections would take place after all illegal armed formations and military equipment was sort of withdrawn. So only after security is established and Ukraine restores control over its borders and legislation is passed that allows for political parties of Ukraine to participate, and elections go ahead in the Donbass. Now, this is not the interpretation that Russia or the separatists gave to the agreement. Russia took a very literate interpretation and put a lot of pressure on Ukraine to really negotiate with these current leaders to find out what would be the modalities of these elections. The separatists initially brought up very stringent conditions. For example, they were arguing that Ukrainian political parties could not participate in the elections, and only individual candidates who came from the region. So making it almost impossible for Ukrainians who were not from the region to also be engaged in the electoral process. Russia, in a way, as we all know, wanted to ensure that pro-Russian forces won the elections in the Donbass and continued to insist that its troops were not involved in the conflict, that they were not really a party to the conflict. Because Russia also saw the implementation of the Minsk Agreement really as an instrument through which it could influence or determine sort of the geostrategic orientation of Ukraine. In particular, through this sort of the control indirectly over political events in these regions, prevent membership of NATO and also of the EU, if that was, as is the aspiration of Ukraine. So I'm very glad that we have here in the panel those who are going to discuss about EU and Ukraine. But this was never really spelled out in the agreement. So this was also a position that Russia and the separatists sort of took over what was really spelled out in the agreements. It was not expected that these regions would have a veto, for example, on NATO membership. So there were immediately a lot of difficulties of implementing these agreements. Various compromise solutions were brought forward. The famous Steinmeier formula, which was not very much welcomed in Ukraine, which in essence envisaged the temporary implementation of the constitutional amendments by Ukraine on election day, and the full implementation if the elections were certified as free and fair by the OSCE. This formula was brought forward by France and Germany within the Normandy format, which was the sort of the format of negotiations, but it was never really accepted by Ukraine, which insisted that security had to come first, and also increasingly domestic opposition to the Minsk Agreement increased. So every time there was an attempt to introduce legislative changes, you know, they were always sort of having very negative repercussions or responses from certain, political areas inside Ukraine. So I'm really rushing through here, because I know there's so many. So my final points are, if I may, the problems with the Minsk Agreement is, first of all, that it was negotiated under force. So Ukraine was compelled to accept many elements because it faced the risk of further advancement by the Russian forces. It was also compelling Ukraine to change its constitution, which was seen in a way almost as unacceptable. Violence also continued along the ceasefire line, and there was no presence of peacekeeping forces or OSCE monitors that could effectively sort of enforce a ceasefire. And last but not least, I think the whole question of sanctions, which I don't know if you guys are going to talk about, but to a certain extent, I think the West became linked to the implementation of the Minsk Agreement, because the sanctions are linked to this element. So,
thanks very much, Domitilla. That's extremely insightful. We're moving on, and we'll have Maxim, our research fellow at the Russian Institute, speak about the role of media in this whole process.
Are you sure that they can hear us?
I believe they can hear, yes. And now I will raise like the flag, the white flag with the red sign in it. About 1 minute when you have that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks, Domitilla, for raising this issue. Really interesting to hear your comments on the recent statements and the report. So, so I think that the question which concerns people most right now is what's happening next. And I don't really want to evaluate the kind of possibility of real engagement, because we're dealing with a personalist autocracy, and these regimes are very close, they are compact, so we never know what happens inside. And even people who are close to the kind of the government they're often not aware of the kind of details of the decision-making process. So it's very risky business trying to assess what's going on inside by looking at what's going on outside. But still, I want to look at this external kind of layer of media and how it was reported, because I think it played a very important role in the dynamics of the whole confrontation. So just three points very briefly. So I want to start by pointing out that like Russian government likes to organize and launch these campaigns, and the whole confrontation, which started in fall, it was from the very beginning designed as a campaign, right? So it was very different from the other Russia's military actions, such as the annexation of Crimea, which was fast, which was swift, which and the Russian government denied its involvement for the time being. So this one was open, demonstrative, and it was long, so they've been moving forces back and forth for some time. And it was clearly kind of more like a campaign rather than some preparation for some action. And this move was quite unprecedented in terms of the scale, so it quickly attracted a lot of attention. And now I think it's safe to say that some of the reactions were a little bit exaggerated. So they started to, so the threat remains real, but many Western kind of media started to emphasize the imminence of the invasion. And now we know from the interviews of many members of the intelligence community that it was a part of the strategy, right? So they switched to this new kind of type of campaigning, and they started to release the evidence, to declassify and release evidence in hopes that some of this information, if some of this information is true, it might prevent this plan from being realized, and at least putting some pressure on the people who are involved in this campaign. And so just yesterday, Zelensky said that, we've been told that there is a possibility of invasion and by Western media, and he was immediately reinterpreted by the press, who said that Zelensky said there will be invasion on Wednesday, right? So, and what Russians are very kind of, Russian media, state officials and spin doctors, they're excellent in dealing with this kind of issues, and they've been doing it for quite a long time. So it's, for them, it's not a kind of new strategy. And if you look at how the conflict is covered inside and was outside in the reports of Russia Today, for instance, you see that they're feeding on this kind of imminence, on this precise days of invasion. And they're kind of very good at kind of deflecting these media criticisms and using them for their own narrative. So RT, for instance, responded in a very kind of usual way. The way it responded to all previous major political events and criticisms, such as topic scandals, such as tripod poisonings. So there are a couple of main strategies. So they rarely focus on the event themselves. Instead, they focus on how other Western media report this event. So if you look at RT, they typically report how New York Times or Washington Post report on this conflict and what people say. And they basically present the statements as arrogant and kind of ungrounded hysteria, which is used as a pretext to put some pressure on Russia. So basically, some scholars call it mirroring, so that instead of saying that we are attacked, we say we are being attacked. So this media just create this hysteria in order to create a pretext for possible political pressure and possibly some military action on the ground from Ukraine or NATO. So the strategy inside was a bit different. So they, like right RT, has to operate in a very kind of competitive media environment where they can allow themselves to be more openly propagandistic, and there are many propagandistic narratives, but it's not even close to the massive propagandistic campaign which we have seen in 2014, 15. So sometimes you see the hawks like Margarita Simonyan, who's the editor-in-chief of Russia Today, or Solovyov, saying that justifying war, or for instance, Simonyan a couple of days ago said in the interview at Solovyov TV show that we are not going to start a war in Ukraine. The only possible reason for Russia to intervene is to end the war in Ukraine, which has been going on for 8 years. So in other words, it doesn't preclude the possibility of using Eastern Ukraine, the conflict that is in Eastern Ukraine, as a kind of pretext to attack. But these narratives are rare, so, and the intensity of reporting is quite low, which suggests that they just do not kind of prepare to justify something big. Well, of course, it's a problem. We cannot deduce Kremlin's actions from how they use TV channels, But sometimes we actually can, and post-factum we know that, like for instance in 2014 we could predict, based on their narratives in the media, they were kind of related to how things were changing on the ground in the eruption of violence. So you could maybe say something about it. So the kind of the slow and open nature of this campaign and the kind of nature of this reaction lead to the conclusion that they've been successful at using this kind of military/media brinkmanship, and partly because this Western kind of reaction increased the perception of threats. So basically, they did some of the work for Putin and for Kremlin. That's my impression. And essentially, the government now, the Russian government, they managed to forcibly put some of their issues on the agenda. One, right? So they got many talks too. And they also damaged Ukrainian economy and society to a significant extent, right? So flights are banned, many embassies are evacuated. And they also distracted us from other very important questions, such as Kazakhstan or Belarus, for instance, right? So there are military exercises in Belarus, and we don't talk about it anymore. And so there were Russian troops in Kazakhstan just a few weeks ago, and now it's not on the agenda anymore. So yeah, my feeling is that they're playing with the strategic ambiguity, using this reaction to increase the threat, the perceived threat, and trying to use it as a leverage, and will continue for a while, right? Because the cost of real engagements are too high. On the one hand, who disengage, it's like, you lose your leverage. So it's like very profitable to stay in this position and explore this ambiguity, try to use blackmail and bullying. That's it.
Thanks very much, Maxim. That's very much within the time limits that were there. So thanks a lot for sticking with that. Alex Clarkson, your.
So thank you very much. And today I'm going to speak about the European and particularly the EU dynamic related to the Ukraine crisis. So as a good historian that I am, I'm going to start in the 17th century. And I think it's worth considering the extent to which many of the discourses around this crisis are profoundly problematic if we think of the agency and centrality of Ukraine and Ukrainian society itself. Most of the debate, particularly in French, German, but also US and British media, places this as a binary, as a crisis between Ukraine and Russia, and then frames this in terms of a kind of exclusive relationship between Ukraine and Russia. Now we have to imagine if we conceptualized the British relationship with Ireland as exclusively structuring Irish history, Irish politics, Irish culture entirely around Britain. And we can already see how problematic this is. In reality, if we go back to the 17th century, I will get to the EU quite soon, don't worry. But if we go back to the 17th century, the formation of modern Ukrainian identity involves multiple poles. It involves a Cossack fiefdom with a strong Ottoman, Turkish, East European, Habsburg, Polish Commonwealth influence, Carpathian gentry and aristocrats with a strong relationship to society in Rome, Greek Catholic community in particular, Berlin, Vienna, Paris. And of course, as the diaspora expands through international migration, you have these connections with New York, Toronto, and the wider world as well, right? So the first point is that this isn't just a Russia-Ukraine relationship. This is about the activeness and centrality of Ukraine. And Ukraine's Europeanization process isn't some recent invention or some external imposition through neoliberalism or any other kind of global structural security economic trend. It's a profound element of Ukrainian society and culture going back centuries. It's part of the kind of formation of these environments. So as the Russian empire expands, it never takes over the entirety of the Ukrainian national territory, by the way, until 1939. There's substantial parts of Ukraine that are ruled by others, never ruled by Russia until the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. But even those areas ruled by Russia have their autonomous and semi-autonomous relationships with the outside world. And in Kharkiv, Kiev, Kherson, Odessa, as this sort of Russian imperial operation, still have all of these relations with the outside world. So as the 20th century progresses, you have multiple projects within the Soviet Communist Party. Figures like Petroshelist or before Mykola Sputnik were also interested in developing Ukraine's position with the USSR and its relationship with the outside world. It had a theoretical UN seat within the Soviet order. It has its own little shadow foreign ministry and defense entity within the Soviet system. The Soviet central authorities feel they have to engage with this sense within Ukrainian society of being a partner within the Soviet system. The failure of the Soviet system to create an equal partnership between Ukrainians and Russians is one of the reasons why Orthodox communist Soviet elites in the late 1980s, early 1990s joined the independence process. Ukraine would have never have become independent if a figure like Leonid Kravchuk, who was the head of the ideological office of the Ukrainian Communist Party in the until the late 1980s, right? Switch sides because they see their interests not just in terms of a national project, but a specific economic, political, financial groups, as Alyukov describes them now. You have a convergence of national narratives, cultural engagement, economic interests, state self-interest. The Russian, the USSR dominant seems less and less interesting or attractive to substantial parts of the Ukrainian elite. So that makes this kind of Europeanization process that begins to kick in 1991. It actually has profound deep roots. And I think that has to be really understood, that this isn't just a Ukraine-Russia relationship, it's a Ukraine-EU relationship that defines this underlying dynamic. And so the second point is, there's the more shorter history of this conflict, this dynamic. Well, the NATO expansion issues and that stuff might be dealt with by my colleagues, and that's also central. But it's this Ukraine-EU dynamic, the extent to which Ukrainian political elites, oligarchic elites, so oligarchs also have, to a certain extent, an interest in limited reform and Europeanization, partly because they can take advantage of the rule of law, partly because of export markets, partly because simply access to EU markets provide an alternative that give them leverage towards Russian elites in terms of economic and political negotiations. So this isn't just nationalists in Western Ukraine. This isn't just specific a political project by state elites in Kiev. This is actually a project that hits a wide consensus along large parts of Ukrainian society. Of course, not all of Ukrainian society. What happens between 1991 and 2013-14 is a tension between different factions in Ukrainian society about the country's geopolitical and geoeconomic position. But it didn't necessarily feel as if it had to lead to this kind of final existential outcome. Because throughout much of this period, the 90s and noughts, a potential Europeanization path, a multi-vector path of Ukraine maneuvering between Russia and the EU seemed possible. Because we have to take the Russian context into the environment as well. We forget now. People were still speaking of a potential Russian NATO membership in the 1990s. There was discussion about, right up until 2010, about a European integration path for Russia. Actually, one of my arguments from an EU perspective, I'm very much an EU guy here in this session, is that one of the biggest mistakes made was talking down Russia's Europeanness in the 1990s, not making a concrete integration offer. That fell into the advantage of elites or Siloviki elites around Putin and others that wanted to pull Russia away from a potential European path. We were never clear about what offer we should give, and I think that's also a discussion for the post-Putin period about what kind of offer we can give to the Russian people and Russian society for an integration process into EU structures. So we arrive at this point where, for a long period, EU institutions, actually many Ukrainian institutions, do not see a clash between close involvement with Russia and integration to the EU. Final point, why does this breakdown happen? It comes to a point that I've made from the EU perspective, because I look at the EU borders, the entirety of the EU borders, so Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and all the rest, but also Sam Green's perspective, as my colleague head of the Russian Institute, Russian Watcher, that at a certain point between 2005 and 2014, Russian elites begin to realize that EU integration isn't just a free trade pact. It isn't just a kind of rewriting of certain legislation and rules. The EU has always been a geopolitical actor without really realizing it, because when you integrate with the EU as a state and society, you rewire the fundamental political economy through which your society is organized. Right? It's a simple process of conditionality. It's always been seen as a kind of expansion process, as a benign process. But for an authoritarian regime like that of Vladimir Putin, as it evolves, that is founded on particular control of economic and political resources, a particular relationship and organization of the rule of law, interfacing with that EU system causes you trouble, even if you're semi-authoritarian. Like the interfacing with the EU system through the customs union already limits Erdogan's room for maneuver in very, very clear ways. You can be authoritarian, but you have to accede to this shared rule set in particular ways and functions and areas that, at least in the context of the Putin regime, distributes the ability of the center to distribute resources. Now, that's not a problem for Ukraine. Right? It's a multipolar, it has authoritarian elements, but it's a multipolar oligarchy. You have all these rival political factions, nobody is ever too dominant, and in the end, you have space for civil society and also a rising military structure post the war. But it is problematic for Russia and Russia's ability to operate within the terms of the Putin regime and its ability to control not just the Eurasian and Ukrainian political space. So without really understanding what they were getting into, the EU gradually, through this kind of blob-like expansion, comes into direct geopolitical conflict in the case of Russia, over places like Ukraine, but with Ukraine acting as a central actor, because there's no EU integration unless not just Ukrainian nationalists or culturalists, but elites political and oligarchic elites want it in their own interest, right? So it's a mix of self-interest and also long-term cultural processes that draw these two systems together in a way that is profoundly tragic and unfortunate, as we can see unfolding now.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's very, very insightful to learn about the European dimension of this crisis. Now, next person I have lined up here is Christoph Meyer from the European International Studies. Christoph, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Okay, that's we don't see you though. If you want, you can switch on your camera. It's up to you.
Okay, I have switched on my camera, so.
Okay, somehow we're not able to see it, but the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I suppose the first point I'd like to make is that from the perspective of media coverage, you could think that the EU is totally irrelevant. There are no meetings of Mr. Lavrov and Mr. Putin with the High Representative, Mr. Borrell, or with the Commission President or the Council President. They're not traveling to Moscow. And you could think, well, the EU doesn't really matter to this crisis. But clearly, if you've studied EU foreign policy, you're not surprised that when politicization is high, the national leaders take the front stage. However, that doesn't mean that the EU has actually been sidelined in the crisis or that it is irrelevant to the crisis. So it's not just the US and NATO that matter, but it is really very much also the role of the EU that matters, how this crisis plays out, and certainly how the dynamics between Ukraine and Russia and the EU more broadly play out in the medium to longer term. So a couple of points to perhaps underline that argument. I mean, the first point, I think, following on from what Alex has just said, the Russian intervention in Ukraine came about as a chain of events that started with Ukraine about to sign the association and deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU. And instead of joining the Russian-led Eurasian Economic Union. So it is clear that certainly from the Russian perspective, the EU has acquired geopolitical importance, even if many in the EU fail to realize it and act accordingly at the time. After Ukraine signed the association agreement, the EU, of course, did act and step up its support. I think it's spent up to 70 billion euros since 2014 in support of Ukraine and strengthening its resilience also against hybrid challenges. The second point I would say is that the EU has been remarkably unified, at least if you compare that to the past and against some of the expectations. The EU has been consulted on the offer that the US has made to Russia, the written offer, so it was consulted on that. I think the EU members, including Mr. Scholz, Mr. Macron, have always been very keen to emphasize that they are not freelancing, but that they are speaking on behalf of the EU, and they will try to support EU unity in dealing with Russia. And France, of course, is holding the presidency. And it is the High Representative who is crucial to putting together sanctions packages. So I think the EU's role in putting together a deterrent sanction package that will be painful enough to Russia is, I think, absolutely central, certainly as important as any military assistance to Ukraine is, certainly in terms of the kind of longer term calculation. In the short term, the EU has also offered quite a bit of extra assistance, macroeconomic assistance. It's got an advisory mission, and it has also used its new European peace facility to support the Ukrainian armed forces. So the EU is moving more and more, not just using its kind of financial muscle, but kind of moving more into the space of supporting Ukraine's security defense. And the fourth point is that the EU is a key actor when it comes to the energy dimension of the sanctions. I think it's very clear now, and certainly to my country of origin, Germany, even if it's a long time ago, that there's a far too high vulnerability and dependence on Russian energy, hydrocarbon imports. So the EU is a key instrument in terms of regulation, but also in terms of pushing the Green Deal to wean itself of that dependence. And it is also in the process of becoming much more of a geopolitical actor, trying to counter many of the threats that have emanated from Russia over the last 10 years, not just against Ukraine, but also against the democratic systems within a number of member states, assassinations, and so forth. So really, I think the EU plays an important role in the crisis, and what the current crisis is doing, it further accelerates a convergence in threat perceptions within the EU, and particularly in large countries such as Germany. And it kind of reinforces the resolve of moving towards what is called strategic autonomy. In that context, I think it's often forgotten that the EU actually does have a version of NATO's Article 5 that in some ways is broader than NATO's Article 5. So that's Article 42, paragraph 7 of the Lisbon Treaty, which says that any EU member that falls victim to an armed aggression on its territory, the other EU countries have an obligation to aid and assist it by all means in their power. Now, this comes with caveats for neutral and non-aligned countries and for also for member state countries. But it is something that is very much live on the agenda at the moment to operationalize that commitment. It's part of the current strategic compass that is being discussed currently with member states. The draft of that is circulating at the moment everywhere. And the EU is really pushing very hard to kind of make the EU an operational actor when it comes to security and defense. So, so it is trying to, I suppose, learn how to speak the language of power, as Mr. Borrell, the High Representative, has said it, and to really live up to its very substantial economic might. Just in terms of figures, the EU's bloc is 10 times larger than Russia. The EU spends 3 to 4 times more on security and defense. And certainly from an EU perspective, but also from an American perspective, it's hard to understand why Europe, whether that's EU Europe or NATO Europe, should not be able to deter Russia and guarantee security for its members. In this context, I think it's quite important to underline that this is very much driven also by current EU members. Some of them are members of NATO and are very worried about the prospect of the US gradually withdrawing from NATO as it focuses more towards China, the prospect of a new Trump 2.0 administration, so a bit of a hedging strategy. But there are also non-NATO members of the EU, such as Finland and Sweden, who see the value that the EU offers in the security defense domain. So I think what I would like to say is that the EU is very much pushing to become more capable and more resilient against future Russian threats, and that if it plays the long game well, it has all the instruments to become, I think, in a position where that security guarantee still bears risks, but is actually meaningful. The big question, of course, is whether the EU, after this experience and whatever plays out now, would ever offer formal EU membership to a country like Ukraine. But certainly it is integrating the Ukraine in ways that I think Alex has rightly described. It is not just free trade. It is a much deeper form of integration, just minus the institutions. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Christoph. Our next speaker is Marc Berenson.
Hello. I guess you can hear me if I'm not too loud. Rather than speak about domestic politics literally, I want to focus now on the primacy of domestic politics and accounting for this crisis. That is how the chosen regime types have provided both constraints upon and motivations for the current situation. Russia and Ukraine, it's very basic to point out, but it's also critical here, not of the same regime type. Russia is an autocracy subject to all the constraints and opportunities afforded to such a regime. Meanwhile, democracies do not threaten war against their own democratic neighbors. Had Russia chosen and stuck with the democratic path, we would not be here today. As an authority, so there's a real reason why we begin our sort of introduction to comparative politics courses by talking about the difference between regime types. As an authoritarian state, there are little constraints on Putin in terms of his ability to make decisions and seek to get those decisions executed. There are no constraints on the Russian leader. He and those he surrounds himself with can operate without checks and balances, with rules, without transparency of any kind. When Putin contemplates an invasion, he doesn't have to consider the interests of Russian businesses, consumers who might suffer from economic sanctions. He doesn't have to consider soldiers or their families and other citizens. They have no say, no voice in the matter that counts. Moreover, during the past 2 years, due to COVID, Putin has subjected himself to greater relative isolation than usual. He's not somebody who's going out on the street the way Boris Yeltsin engaged in walkabouts about town. He is surrounding himself by people who enable him to think the way he wants to think. So there's no constraints that way on his yeah. Is there an echo of my voice?
No, we hear you well, actually.
Okay. So the greatest constraint, though, of all for Putin, and he knows this very well, is that he has to stay in office in order to survive. Above all, Putin's overriding objective is to political survival. And like any authoritarian leader, he fears that free and successful countries on his periphery may infect his own population with dreams of democracy and reform. Because of the nature of the regime, the way it started, the way it has continued to rule, Putin can't retire from office and enjoy all the wealth that he's accumulated. I personally think the wealth that he's accumulated is much more of a status thing as he tries to be the arbitrator in chief amongst the different patronage groups back in Moscow, rather than something that he sort of aspires for in terms of a standard of living that he would like to lead. The neighboring countries that follow the rule of law prevent the spread of this patronage and networks that Moscow has relied upon to feed into the wealth of Kremlin allied elites. Moreover, once rule becomes coercive, and over the last 22 years that Putin is in power, the regime has become slowly more coercive as the years have gone by. It cannot let up. Putin can't reverse and suddenly open up the system to more political competition. Meanwhile, next door is Ukraine. It's a democracy, a flawed democracy, and there are many flawed democracies around the world at the moment. But the country that has seen its population vote out of office every single president that has sought a second term, except for one, and that was President Leonid Kuchma, since 1991. Ukrainians have demonstrated to their neighbors, to themselves, that they believe autocracy doesn't work for them. It doesn't provide them with the goods and services, and that they can make democracies thrive in another post-Soviet country that is not part of the Baltic states. Putin recognizes that if freedom and democracy do succeed in Ukraine, it's only a matter of time before Russians will want that for themselves as well. Having a democratic Ukraine is a thwart into the authoritarian political model of Putin. Moreover, Putin was extremely frightened of the Orange Revolution in 2004, besides the more recent revolution in Euromaidan Revolution of 2014. But as a reaction to that, he suppressed internally in trying to prevent such a revolution from taking place within his own country. Moreover, Russia and Ukraine are really different different polities. They have different political cultures. I found this out when I was doing research for my book, Taxes and Trust. Ukrainians have a very different relationship with authority than Russians do. Ukrainians don't want autocracy. They are less willing to do what the state asks them to do because they are less fearful of the state and they're less trusting of the state to provide them with goods and services and to treat them fairly. Russians, meanwhile, are much more afraid of trying to stand up and combat or overthrow autocratic rule. The greatest pity with respect to Russia is that it has never had economic growth at a time of political polarization. As a result of all of this, Putin, above all else, he has a long wish list he wants to sort of achieve with this current situation. But I think at the bare minimum, he wants to destabilize Ukraine. He wants to make it unattractive to the EU, NATO, the West, foreign investors, and especially to Russians themselves. I don't think that he's necessarily desiring to reconstitute the Soviet Union. Belarus has been aligned with Russia for a while and hasn't yet been formally invited into a union with Russia. But I think that Putin is preparing to invade Ukraine again, or pretend that he's going to invade Ukraine again, for the reason that he wants to destabilize the country. He needs to have both its economy and democracy be perceived as a basket case and a failure. I don't think people would have started this route in the last year, building up troops on the border, if Russia's war in the Donbass had shown signs of succeeding for the Kremlin. I think for the purposes, the Donbass war has failed, and the annexation of Crimea and the support for the war in the Donbass has not deterred Ukraine's movement towards the West. And I think that's what really motivated Putin in 2014. Moreover, there hasn't been a strong fascist takeover in Ukraine. The Russian media currently is ramping up its domestic programming by talking about the imminent flood of Ukrainian fascist threats to the motherland. Meanwhile, you have next door in Ukraine a president, Volodymyr Zelensky, who is Jewish, who is a native Russian speaker from Ukraine's east, clearly shows that being a native Ukrainian speaker or even being a fascist is not what is needed to rise to the top of Ukrainian politics and society. Putin's invasion of Crimea was an attempt to punish Ukrainians for trying to escape the kleptocratic system that he wanted them to live in order for Ukraine in order for the Kremlin system in Russia to thrive. Moreover, there are very many other attempts beyond the Donbass region, beyond Crimea, in 2014, in Odessa, Kharkiv, and several other cities that had large Russian-speaking populations that did not succeed in going a part of what Putin's plan was. The only area where fighting and conflict was able to continue was in the Donbass regions because it was so easy for equipment, troops, and other things to come across the border. With respect to the Minsk Agreement that Domitilla expertly outlined, in my opinion, the Minsk agreements have been and will continue to go nowhere because the bone of contention is not over land, not over language, not over resources, not over money, but the bone of contention is over the sovereignty of Ukraine itself. Ukraine views agreement with respect to the Donbass as, at bare minimum, it has to retain a unitary state and prevent Russia from interfering in its politics. And Russia has gone into and supported the rebellion in the Donbass region precisely because it wants to have a say and control over Ukrainian politics. With respect to neutralization of Ukraine.
Actually, Mark, if you could wrap up, would be great.
Okay, so I think that the time for making Ukraine a neutral state has long passed. It was around, I think, from 1994 when the Budapest Agreement was signed up until 2014, before Russia invaded and annexed parts of Ukraine. I think the Ukrainian population would have agreed to becoming a neutral state. The time for that has passed, and the Ukrainians will not support that. And Ukraine is enshrined in its goal to join NATO within its constitution. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Mark. And last but not least, Ruth Deyermond from War Studies will talk about the West/NATO dimension in the crisis.
Thank you. Sorry, have you muted the room? If you could mute, yeah, you have, brilliant, thank you. So I will attempt within the allotted 7 minutes to cover this very, very large topic of the kind of NATO dimension and specifically the US dimension as well. I think the first thing to say is that the Russia-NATO, Russia-US facet of the crisis is complicated, as is the crisis as a whole, by the fact that the Russian government is simultaneously denying any attention to attack Ukraine while also making demands as if it were. And that's obviously a kind of curious situation for the Russian government to put itself in, and it makes negotiation that much more difficult. The other kind of contextual point I would make is that I think the crisis has probably, at least the Western dimension of it, has probably been exacerbated by the fact that last autumn, NATO-Russia diplomatic relations effectively shut down when Russian diplomats were expelled from NATO, allegedly for spying, and there was a kind of tit-for-tat response by the Russian government. So the absence of any kind of institutional level diplomatic engagement is clearly unhelpful. On the US, you know, a little bit of important context, I think, is the wider relationship between Russia and the US under the Biden presidency. Biden came to power explicitly stating that he wanted pragmatic engagement with Russia on arms control and other areas, while recognizing the limits of that as a possibility of that pragmatic relationship. And the background to his position on that was the situation he inherited from the Trump administration on Ukraine, as well as on Russia generally. And on Ukraine, it's a whole other complicated issue, which I won't get into here. But in summary, you had a situation where most of the US government was saying one thing about Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity and Russia's aggression, and Trump himself was saying something entirely different. And that, together with the kind of Trump alienation of the US from NATO, I think has added an additional level of uncertainty about US intentions in respect of Ukraine, US intentions in respect of NATO. There's been some suggestion that the current crisis is a mechanism by which the Russian government has tried to test the Biden administration, and a mechanism for forcing concessions. And in that respect, arms control has been talked about as a potential concession that the Russians may be getting. But I would be very wary about that because, as I said, the Biden administration had expressed an interest in arms control discussions long before the start of this crisis. The US reaction has been, as I'm sure you're all aware, extremely strong, and some, including the Ukrainian government, would say alarmist. There's been a big public spat between the Ukrainian and US governments about the US governmental references to war being imminent. The Ukrainian government doesn't like that characterization. And the Ukrainian government, I think, seems to feel that the very strident American kind of discussion of what might happen is damaging the Ukrainian economy. We can see a kind of, the level of the US kind of response to the crisis in the fact that last night, I think it was, a decision was taken to move the US embassy from Kiev to Lviv and to destroy the IT equipment in the Kiev embassy. NATO more generally, it's hugely complicated by the fact that there are significant splits within NATO over the severity of the crisis, over how to support Ukraine and how to respond to Russia. And it's clear that, as well as kind of long-standing trends in relations with Russia that are different between different NATO states, current domestic politics are obviously also playing a significant role in the response of individual states. And in this, we can, for example, compare the position of Germany to the very kind of US-style kind of strident response of the UK government, which seems to be trying to distract from its own domestic problems, to the kind of more statesman-like approach of Macron, who is facing an election, of course. think there's, speculation about whether Russia has been trying to use its approach to Ukraine as a mechanism for widening pre-existing splits inside NATO. And in this respect, we could perhaps see it as performing the same function as the recent Belarusian manipulation of the migrant crisis on Belarus's border with NATO members. In terms of what Russia wants from NATO as a kind of exchange for not pursuing this crisis, Putin again was very clear in his press conference with the German Chancellor this afternoon. He wants agreement that Ukraine will never join NATO, and that Europe will return to the kind of military disposition of pre-1997. So NATO will essentially move back to its position before enlargement. And this is clearly not going to happen, right? And the Russian government can't really reasonably expect it to happen. It's unlikely, I think, that NATO is going to commit to ruling out Ukrainian accession because of the implications for NATO as an institution. But it's also clear that everyone, the Russians, the Ukrainians, and NATO, understands that Ukraine is not joining NATO in the near or medium term. And it's also, and this is an interesting recent development, clear that some NATO members are willing to contemplate ruling out NATO membership. Within the last hour, I think the new German Chancellor in a press conference seems to have been saying that he would be willing to rule out Ukrainian membership of NATO, which is obviously not great for Ukraine, right? To finish very quickly, the effect of this crisis, and I always end up saying this about Russia-US relations or Russia-NATO relations, but it's true, that the effect of this crisis is that Moscow-NATO relations are now at their lowest level since the deep Soviet-NATO crisis of the early 1980s, and that makes it a very dangerous moment. But I think that danger is tempered by two things. Firstly, that everyone recognises the danger, which is necessary for people to approach with caution. And that secondly, nobody realistically expects that any conflict in Ukraine would expand to pull in NATO, because of course Ukraine isn't a NATO member. And so I will stop there, I think.
Thank you very much, Ruth. I guess we can start with questions if you have. I have quite a few myself, but I won't use this prerogative of being a moderator. I'll just leave it to the audience. So let's start with any members of the audience that want to raise questions. And the passive audience, we also have quite a series of questions that have been posted online. But I'm going to give basically the opportunity first to this audience here. Anyone wants to? Yes, please go ahead.
Well, I have two questions.
Could you also identify yourself and also whom you would like to ask the question?
Yeah, my name is Alex, and I have two questions. First to Mr. Clarkson. As far as I understand, you are considering things from the constructivist perspective, and about the Ukrainian identity. Don't you think that there is a contradiction between Ukrainian anti-Russian, anti-Soviet identity and the idea of Crimea being annexed, because the Crimea is a Soviet presence to the Crimea, so you can't be to Ukraine, so you can't really support. You can't be anti-communist and enjoy the Crimea. And the second question to Marc. Well, you have used a lot of propagandistic terms like authoritarian regime, authoritarian leader. Don't you think that it is very insulting for millions of Russians that support the president? And in that case, I can hear that you divide people into two groups. The first group, people in the West that have right to choose their leader. And the second group are Russians, they don't have a right to choose their leader. So there was one very particular ideology that divided people into two groups. Are you a fan of this particular ideology?
Right. Who would like to ask a question?
There's a third group of people here, is the Tatars. The Crimean Tatars were deported by the Soviet regime, who were removed, Israelites, sent to Kazakhstan, died in large numbers. So they didn't have a say in the matter. think the tendency among the Tatar organizations, who are the indigenous people of Crimea, was to look towards a relationship with Ukraine. So I think that's the first thing to keep in mind. Is that if we're going to use the term indigeneity and use a kind of colonial or post-colonial framework, then we have to consider who are the original indigenous people of this space and what is their orientation. They also have appealed to their old, Crimea as a Khanate had a profound relationship with the Ottoman Empire. And I think if we look in terms of relationships between the Crimean Tatar organizations, the AKP, or the Turkish government, as if we want to think in these terms, is the inheritor of the Ottoman Empire. It's quite clearly stated that Crimea is part of Ukraine because of the indigenous choices of the Tatar people, and that this relationship should be recognized. Now, there's a substantial population of Russian settlers, primarily resettled during the Soviet period, who are oriented towards Russia, and they're, I think, long-term, yes. You have to think in terms of this, a bit like Northern Ireland. This is a community, we call them maybe unionists, whose interests should be respected, and this is part of the general arrangement, maybe reflecting Ukrainian legal sovereignty over Crimea, but also a dual relationship with Russia. We have all these laws around Europe. This is all possible. However, there was a substantial part of the Crimean population, many of which has now fled into exile, been imprisoned, cannot speak their language, that was Ukrainian. They were loyal to the Ukrainian state. They had interests, they were citizens. Their interests were not respected. So I think we need to consider this in terms of, there was a legal international law component to this. This needs to be respected as Ukrainian sovereignty. There's a substantial part of the Crimean population oriented towards Russia. That needs to be respected. There's a Ukrainian-speaking population or a Russian-speaking population that was loyal to Ukraine, that protested on Maidan for the Maidan cause, whose wishes need to be respected. And perhaps most relevantly in the context that we frame this, there's an indigenous Tatar people who have suffered horrifically under a succession of Moscow-ruled regimes, who I think are owed something by Moscow, by Kyiv, by Brussels, by Washington, and by Istanbul, Ankara, for what they have suffered, and their wishes should be respected. And their respect is of a relationship with the Ukrainian state. This is all possible in a post-Putin environment, potentially one in which the European Union makes integration offer to the Russian people that doesn't dismiss the Europeanness of Russia, but maybe says, look, if you're willing to fulfill the conditions of belonging to the EU system, we accept you as Europeans, but you have to accept the European Union's rule set established through the cooperation of 27 countries, 32 if you include the EEA and EFTA, and Ukraine to the DCFTA, Turkey even through the customs union. If you accept this rule set, you can be part of this cooperative environment, and maybe a solution for Crimea should be found. But this should respect all the peoples of Crimea, not one faction, not other faction, but particularly respect the relationship of the indigenous people of Crimea, the Muslim Tatar people who have suffered enough.
Right. Would anybody else want to answer the question that was raised, or part of the question? Okay, Marc, did you want to? No, but actually, did you want to answer the question that was raised in class, or some of the questions that are posted?
I'll try to do both.
Okay, all right, go ahead, please. Yes, so just to recap, some of the questions, of course, that are posted, as you might have seen on the screen, are about Putin's motivations. Does he really need to invade Ukraine in order to stay in power? Is kind of, if I could paraphrase that, doesn't he have other means to do that, for instance? So yes, go ahead, Marc.
Sure. With respect to the question about regime type, I think that question kind of. Do you hear an echo?
No.
Hi, can you hear me now? Can you nod? Okay. So the question about regime types kind of reminds me of the old joke that there are two types of people. One type that divides people into two types, another type who doesn't. Quite frankly, I take the study of regime types from the bare basic fundamentals of political science. And the world is divided up into countries that have different forms of governing systems within their countries. You go to the World Bank, you can go to a lot of different sources, and they'll list a variety of democracies, a variety of authoritarian states, and there's a wide variety even within that latter category. Certainly, Singapore is an authoritarian state, but one in which the people seem to be very satisfied with how they're living there. Their living standards are much higher than even in the UK per capita. These are just basic sort of fundamentals of political science. I think that this, however, is a prime motivation for Putin's activities. I also think that the reasons why Putin is focused on Ukraine are overdetermined. There's several reasons. They coincide. They're very difficult for us to tease out per se and say which one is more important than the other. I think Putin has espoused the notion of trying to gain greater respect as Mary has written in the chat here. Certainly, he wants equal security for himself and for his neighbors, and wants greater prominence. The question is, why does Putin keep coming back to Ukraine? Putin's been going into Ukraine since the beginning of his tenure. There have been different, it's far beyond just the association agreement of 2014 and 2014 in that crisis situation. Putin has been trying to influence Ukrainian politics through money, through oligarchs, through different means, through supporting different candidates going back a while. And I don't know whether this is Putin's moment. This may not be Putin's time for resolving his issue with Ukraine, but I think he will come back. I don't think this is going to go away. And the question for the rest of us is the international order, the international community, going to stand by and provide some protection to Ukraine or not? This is obviously not the only crisis situation that could develop in the world. But I don't think that it's going to easily go away, even if all the troops go back, or if Putin does the opposite and has a full-blown invasion.
Right. Ruth, you also would like to answer this?
Yeah, just on that point, and if you, yeah, brilliant. Just to follow up on what Marc was saying about Putin coming back repeatedly to Ukraine. I mean, I think this doesn't start with Putin, right? This was also true in the 1990s. Ukraine has been a central preoccupation for post-Soviet Russia, the entirety of the post-Soviet period. In the 1990s, there was a great deal of back and forth over control of the Black Sea Fleet, and therefore by implication access to the Crimean Peninsula as a whole. There was concern about the status of Crimea. The Commonwealth of Independent States was set up. It was widely understood largely as a mechanism by which Russia was attempting to continue to bind Ukraine in particular into ongoing military and economic arrangements. So, for all sorts of reasons, political, strategic, economic, cultural, identity reasons, Ukraine has been the most important of the post-Soviet states for Russia. And that's not going to change. It's not just about Putin, although he has his own particular concerns, but it's something that has always been the case. And it's something that gets left out of too many kind of Western discussions, I think, which tend too often to treat the crisis as if it's something that appeared out of nowhere in 2014.
Thanks to both of you. And indeed, a part of the question was relating to the Baltics. Why exactly they were not posing the model that threatens Putin's regime? Well, I guess two of you made it quite clear that there is actually substantial difference between what Ukraine can present Russia, the extent of threat, or imagined or real, for the Putin regime versus the Baltics. There is a kind of a significant difference in the magnitude there. Now, I'd like to get a question from this audience, if possible. There was a hand there.
Yeah, I
Yes, go ahead. Could you identify yourself and tell us, please?
My name is Marina Devarki. I'm a student of Russian Institute, and probably my question to Alex and to continue, because I hear so many times this narrative that Crimea was presented during the Soviet Union to Ukraine, and my question, why we take just this part of the history, Crimean history, and why when you relate all the history of Crimea, and why we take just Soviet Union period, and because actually I don't see the sense in this question, because I see just the narrative of the authoritarian regime.
Okay.
I think
Yes, go ahead.
this is. I mean, I work on the entire EU border space. So Ukraine is one of several. I work on Turkey EU relations. I work on Libya EU relations. I work on Algeria EU and the Sahel. Right. So I'm looking at this from the EU's perspective, and the EU has. I wrote an article for this last year. A whole bunch of intermediate spaces of conflicting sovereignty. So if you look at, say, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, you go to Cyprus and you're on the Greek side of Cyprus and you hear one narrative, anchored in history. And you go to the Turkish side of Cyprus and you hear another narrative in history. Now, legally, the TRNC is, according to international recognition, is Cypriot. That's what we recognize. Legally, Crimea, and I support this, is the international legal framework, and the way it happened was disastrous for the international legal framework, right? Legally, Crimea is Ukrainian. We do have to deal with the fact that people in Kiev say this, like on the government level, they're not, how do we reintegrate this space? Acknowledge there's a substantial population in Crimea that has a different narrative historically. So how do we deal with this problem? And this is a problem the EU around its border space is to deal with a whole different. Gibraltar is another classic case of what, thank God, God is insane, right? So what we have to deal with is how do we reintegrate this space if in a post-Putin environment, and we have to stop defining our relationship with Russia around Vladimir Putin. We have to start thinking about strategically about Russia, not through a form of telepathy, what's he thinking? But this is a society with different elites and structures. We have to think 10, 20, 30 years down the line, because that's what great powers do, and the EU is becoming something a little bit like that, right? So if we're looking at Crimea and saying, after Putin, we want to make an offer to the Russians, people, to integrate them into our system, if they want to, it's up to them. Then we're going to have to deal with Crimea somehow, because Ukraine very much is going to be part of that system, if not a full member, maybe something like Norway, right? So we have to think creatively, as we have done with Northern Ireland, as we're trying to do with the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, how do we bring these different narratives together and create a functioning and stable state that recognizes the basics of international law, but also recognizes the fact that, yeah, okay, that referendum was off base, but a substantial part of the population supported enough to make it a viable, fast takeover, right? So I think we do have to think about that post-Putin order, how we deal with Crimea. And I think to Ukraine's credit, and the credit of people in Kiev, there are enough people who will realistically say this to you, thinking about it. But that means we have to think about it too, right?
Right, great, thank you. Yes, there's a question from over there. Yes,
Domi, I missed your presentation, but the future and the potential link to Minsk agreements is quite central. And forgive me if you have already given your opinion to the audience, but from my circle of experts on Russia and Ukraine, there is a big disagreement going on about whether Minsk agreements and the adherence to them is the only way for Ukraine to go in terms of resolving somehow the problems. Keith Darden, for example, and some other notable observers of Ukrainian and Russian politics are arguing this way. And just maybe a few days ago, Oksana Shevel and Maria Popova published in the journal Democracy their short article about, that any call towards adhering to Minsk agreements is not going to resolve the problem. Is going to be problematic for Ukraine. Is going to give additional pretexts to Russian aggression and things like that. So all are very respected scholars with contrasting different opinions on the role left for Minsk agreements? What's your opinion on this?
Thank you, Gulnaz. Thank you so much for coming and for your question. I think that the problem, there are two questions. On the one hand, the Minsk agreement is seen as a diplomatic way out. So every time when we talk about a diplomatic solution to the Donbass crisis, everyone talks about Minsk, even though many people maybe have not looked at the details. So Minsk is almost become the synonymous of peaceful resolution. But then when we look at which I try to highlight sort of the main points of the Minsk agreement and the positions of the side, they have become almost incompatible. So I am increasingly of the position that the Minsk agreement is not the way out of this crisis. This is my own position. I think that it's time, and I think President Macron said a bit that it's time to think about sort of novel mechanisms of resolving this conflict in the Donbass. And I think also one of the weaknesses of the Minsk agreement, which I didn't mention, is that it didn't really include what about Crimea. So there was such a rush to reach an agreement because of concerns of the use of force, that a very important aspect of the whole equation and the future of Ukraine, which Alex mentioned, was left outside of it. And I think that is because we think that if we resolve Donbass, we resolve the question around Ukraine, and it leaves a huge problem around Crimea, which remains unresolved. So I'm of the view that we need almost to think of both all together and sit down realistically and think about solutions around the question of Minsk, of a Minsk III, or we can call it in any other way. I think what is, in terms of more of the content, I think it is clear that in Ukraine, it's very hard to have a government. I mean, everyone knows in Ukraine that if you sign the Minsk agreement, you implement it, you lose power. You're going to be kicked out in some way. It reminded me a bit of Armenia in the 1990s, this perception that every time you make a compromise, you lose your internal support. And this is a key problem, and the way it was framed and the conditions under which it was signed, to me, are the problem. So it's very problematic because of the conditions under which this agreement was signed, and the perception by many in Russia, even liberals with whom I am in touch, who would argue that Russia was in a stronger position, so it could sort of impose a sort of an agreement on the losing side, and that gives it some sense of legitimacy. And I think that is something that I think we should start questioning. I mean, to what extent is Minsk? What is the legitimacy of this agreement if it was signed under these conditions? But of course, this is very difficult to achieve because, from the Russian point of view, the way they think about this agreement and the way they would like this agreement to be implemented, it's so satisfactory to what they wanted to achieve. It's very hard to say, no, now we're going to change our, if I have one moment, one of the issues which was a lot in discussion around Minsk was the fact that Kiev had basically given up on Minsk and was ready to use force in the Donbass and the so-called, Croatian Krajina scenario. So Hrvatski scenario is very much in the news, and this idea that Ukrainians are going to use force, as the Croats did in 1995, expelling Serbs from the Krajina region of Croatia. So I think that this is an element which is relevant to the narrative, maybe. To what extent is there an element of truth in this narrative? I mean, was Ukraine ever really considering using force or not? And this is something that I want to find out a bit more once I am able to go to Ukraine. So that's one of the key issues, because it's all still a bit sort of not clear whether there was a real intention to do that. But certainly it was part of the Russian narrative. We need to send a message to Kiev that there is no way that they should use force to retake the Donbass.
Right, thank you. Ruth, did you want to respond as your hand is up still?
No, I'm afraid I put my hand up because, as I think I mentioned a couple of days ago, I actually need to go now, I'm afraid, because I'm taking part in another discussion with another group. So just want to say thank you very much to everyone for great questions and really interesting comments from colleagues.
Thank you, Ruth. Thanks.
Bye.
We'll continue with a few more questions. Is there something, is someone else? Yes, go ahead, please.
This isn't a question so much as a point. So I was just in Donbass for a month and a half. And one thing that's not being addressed here, maybe because no one's been there recently, is this division that we think Russia is imposing on Ukraine. It's internal. Eastern Ukraine is full of Russophiles, as is southern Ukraine. And there is a serious internal political division in the country. I met people all over Donbass, and not just in Donbass, who have no use for Kiev. They have no use for an independent Ukraine. These are Ukrainians. By the way, ethnic doesn't mean anything. They don't talk about it there. They talk about language and culture. They don't talk about ethnicity. There are so many Ukrainian Russophiles in Donbass, up and down the border, who have no use for an independent Ukraine and who support the LPR and the DPR. And those entities have survived as long as they have, precisely because they have so much internal support on the far side of the border, but also in Donbass, also all in Donbass and Odessa, all over southern Ukraine, and not just those regions. The division we're talking about exists there internally. It's not Russian propaganda. It's not imposed by Russia. It's a division that's been there. It's a hangover since Soviet times, and there's a great deal of Soviet nostalgia in Donbass, and a lot of people who turned against Ukrainian independence almost as soon as it occurred 30 years ago.
Okay.
I think a second point that needs to be mentioned is the Novorossiya project, which is not a joke and not propaganda either. That's a real thing, and Ukraine is part of it. It's part of a larger picture that includes Moldova and Georgia. And a larger foreign policy project that has little to do with strategy, but a great deal to do with history and philosophy.
Okay, all right. Thank you for your comment. As I have a question from the online audience directed at Maxim. If you could tell us, the question is today's Duma request to recognize the independence of Donbass Republic and Lugansk. Is it part of a media campaign, and the other part of the question is, do you get any clues from Russia's media campaign about false flag operation in Ukraine?
Yeah, regarding this request, if I'm not mistaken, so it's a strange story because there were two, I think, requests from different parties, right? So from the United Russia
and the Communist Party,
yeah. Which kind of suggests that there is a strange internal competition going on, and I don't think that Putin will agree to this, and it's more like part of this, not only media but also political campaign. So it's another kind of issue on agenda, another kind of threat. So if you don't do this, we do this. So, but I also suspect that there might be this internal domestic political competition going on. So with kind of close to power or something like this. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Great.
Because so agreeing and kind of recognizing them and basically canceling the Minsk Agreement. That's it was pointed out many times. It's kind of he loses leverage, right? So that was the point with Eastern Ukraine from the very beginning. So it seems to be more like just one more kind of threat rather than real.
Right. Any other questions from this audience? And if not,
from the point that was raised by James.
Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
James, thank you. I think it's a very important point, and I think that what you highlight are actually the tensions, that I feel or I sense exist inside Ukraine between a desire of a more effective nation-building project, which we see through the education and language laws. This idea that everybody should speak the same language and feel better integrated. independently of where they come from. And at the same time, the need to allow communities inside Ukraine, not just sort of Russian speakers or Russophiles, but also Hungarians or Romanians, or who should be in a way able, to sort of develop their own identities and languages and cultures. And I think here the EU is in a very strong position to be a bit more sort of demanding on Ukraine to put pressure that these regional, or let's call it regional, or dimensions, are sort of integrated within the system of governance. But of course, from the Ukrainian point of view, there is also a challenge that these arrangements might eventually challenge the territorial integrity of the state. And I think to find the right balance, where you strengthen the Ukrainian state without undermining sort of a tendency towards separatism, is where the challenge lies.
I think it's also worth considering the limitations of the separatist movement. I mean, if you look at, in terms of raw numbers, in terms of where the Ukrainian military was in 2014, when they took Sloviansk, they simply did not have the personnel numbers to put down a mass rebellion. And I think particularly if you look at specific dynamics in Mariupol, but also Odessa in May 2014, there is a division. There was substantial parts of the population who were willing to fight for the Ukrainian state. And actually, the key recruitment grounds for the Ukrainian army are basically in two spaces: Dnipro, Zaporizhia, right, supposedly Novorossiya. You have substantial recruitment for the Navy in Odessa. And you, of course, have recruitment grounds on Lviv and Bukovina. Right?
And not just all, it's all over.
It's all over the country.
Yeah.
And Kharkiv is actually one of the core grounds for the
No, it's a vastly different place.
I think what we then have then is an environment where you have a minority, which is, I mean, if you look at the opposition bloc voting rates, that's the kind of where you're at. That has to be acknowledged. On the other hand, the reason the Ukrainians won, and they won substantial parts of that fight, was they had local support, because they would never have won if you did not have enough people who were willing to pick up guns and shoot their neighbors.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, that's the thing that needs to be kept in mind. This is what the European Union is about, is trying to balance these tensions and find a civil society and democratic institutional structure to manage them into a more peaceful environment.
Right, and I'd like to give the last word to Christoph. You wanted to say something.
Yeah, perhaps also just to echo in the room to get that removed. Okay, yeah, I think just to broaden the picture a little bit out from Ukraine, as important as it is, I think from the perspective of Brussels in particular, but also I think increasingly a number of member states, this is a test case of how to engage with a revisionist Russian strategy that has been in evidence increasingly over time, and certainly since 2013-14 intensified, namely that Russia has in various ways decided that it is no longer enough to kind of have a defensive attitude, but really to push back, to see what are the ways in which they can destabilize Western democracies, support extremist parties. You've got the cyber attacks on institutions. You had the assassinations of EU citizens in different capitals. So I think the picture, certainly from the EU perspective, is much broader, and that raises the stakes of EU unity and kind of supporting Ukraine, because it is not just about supporting Ukraine. It is about, are you giving in to a kind of going back to a spheres of influence thinking? Are you giving in to a strategy of marching up troops and saying, I put the gun to your head, and if you don't give in, you have to do it? The problem for the EU is, and for many member states, that it is at this maximum point of weakness in terms of dependence on gas and in terms of military capacity that hasn't quite caught up from the financial crisis. So I think this is really a test case, and that's, I think, why the stakes for the EU and for the West are so high, but also why I think for Russia, yes, Ukraine is a special case, but I think ultimately, I think the big prize for Mr. Putin is if the next administration in the US is a populist one by some sort of a Trumpian leader, because that would be the ultimate victory for Russia. And I think if there was war in Ukraine, ultimately, I think that could, in the short term, help to defeat the Democrats.
Thank you very much, Christoph. And unfortunately, this is where we will need to end the event, as we are just running out of time.
Adnan, I have my hand raised. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, if it's like a brief intervention, yes, go ahead, please.
I just want to answer the question that Alonso posed earlier with respect to, doesn't Putin already have enough powers to suppress any type of democratic movements within Russia? I don't think my estimation really matters as much as it is his Putin's estimation. And I think Putin knows far more about his own country than I do. But since 2004, they have continuously bombarded the airwaves in Russia with anti-Ukrainian propaganda and other things. And I think that Putin has continuously gone after Ukraine, and this is one line of analysis that I think still holds, regardless of whether realistically Putin could or could not suppress a rebellion internally. Perhaps he does. He thinks he doesn't have that. Maybe he does.
Right. Thank you, Marc. So, well, this is unfortunately we just came to like 2 minutes after the hour. We need to stop here. I apologize to those who have raised some questions, and if they were not answered, I can see that some of the questions are actually answered within the chat. So go ahead and check that, and the entire event has been recorded as well, so you can actually go back to it as well. Just please join me in thanking our distinguished 6 scholars. And thank you very much also to our audience that has actually has come to King's here, and also the audience that has joined us online. In 3 weeks' time, we'll have another event that focuses on Ukraine, this time more on the economic aspects and sanctions-related aspects relating to Russia. I hope to see you there soon. So have a good evening.
Thank you.